Before I begin, I have a quick reminder. If this channel can hit 5,000 subscribers by July, I'll make a video talking about the entirety of the Kingdom Keepers book series. So if you want to see that, make sure you're subscribed. Thank you so much, and enjoy the video. 30 years ago today, Disneyland Paris opened its gates. The park included many familiar attractions, but also some new ones. Some were entirely new, made just for the park, while others were new spins on classic formulas. And perhaps no attraction fit the latter better than Phantom Manor. For 30 years now, Phantom Manor has amazed guests as a thrilling and chilling dark ride, and a welcome addition to the Haunted Mansion family. Unlike its American and Japanese counterparts, Phantom Manor had a more explicit story and lore, if guests were willing to look deeply enough. And with that came much speculation and questioning. What happened to the fiance? Are those ghosts of the people of Thunder Mesa, or just random spirits? Why doesn't that animatronic work anymore? But the most pressing question of all centered on the ride's most central figure, the Phantom. Despite being so prominent, the ride left his history and story vague for many years. And where there's vagueness and ambiguity, fans will be there to pick up the slack and answer the questions. I would know. And while they did eventually unmask him, many of these theories still persist. Because half the fun with fandom is ignoring canon when you think it's dumb.
I recognize the council has made a decision, but given that it's a stupid-ass decision, I've elected to ignore it.
Either way, it's still fun to look back on and find out how and why these theories took hold. And that's exactly what we'll be doing today. A fun little retrospective in honor of the attraction's 30th anniversary. Because if it's lasted for that long, there has to be something about it that clicks with people. This isn't going to be any kind of definitive list of every single fan theory that was out there, so please don't leave comments like, "Where's the theory that the Phantom was, well, I don't know, the Ravenswood's plumber?" Actually, scratch that. That sounds like fun. Leave me a comment making up a buck-wild theory about the Phantom's identity and explain how it works. I'll pin my favorite. Either way, this is just gonna be a fun little retrospective about a ride I'm interested in. But let's get past the introductions and talk about it together. For the uninitiated, I'll catch you up to speed. Phantom Manor is a dark ride attraction at Disneyland Paris, which opened with the rest of the park in 1992. Located in Frontierland, it's the park's equivalent of the Haunted Mansion. Imagineers chose not to replicate the mansion for Paris in order to appeal to European audiences. Mansions and big graveyards are a dime a dozen in places like France, so that's not going to be nearly as interesting, which is why it's in Frontierland this time around. In addition to the new setting, the ride was much darker in tone. Haunted Mansion, for all of its waxing about creepy creeps and grim grinning ghosts, is a pretty lighthearted attraction. When you get down to it, it's just a bunch of ghosts having a party and goofing around. There is no such revelry in Phantom Manor. It's a story of grief and loss, accented by possibly the single most evil Disney villain of all time. The basic story of Phantom Manor centers on a bride. The day of her wedding, her groom goes missing. Unbeknownst to her, he was killed by a malevolent spirit known only as the Phantom. And after he killed him, he continued to haunt her for the rest of her natural life. That's the bare bones, and pretty much all that your average park guest would have picked up on when they wrote the attraction. But with that vague story outline, Phantom Manor managed to attract a cult fanbase, even among those who lived outside of Europe. And as the internet started to grow, more people started to learn about it and talk about it. And eventually, people who knew people that worked on the ride began to share that information as well. Attentive guests could pick up on some of the characters' names and histories. Located on an end table in the boudoir are letters addressed to a woman named Melanie from an unnamed lover, so we can presume that she is the bride. And in the Boot Hill Cemetery at the ride's exit, there's a tombstone for the master of the house named Henry Ravenswood. And there are a bunch of other little details like that. According to the backstory created by Imagineers, he was the owner of the mines in Big Thunder Mountain and perished in a massive earthquake triggered by the Thunderbird. He also forbade his daughter from leaving the mansion, and before his death, swore he'd keep her from marrying her love of her life under any circumstances. Details like this would be canonized by Disney in any future publications about Phantom Manor. So, while the ride was fairly oblique with its story, there is enough there to get fans interested. But the question of the Phantom's identity still remained a mystery. When it comes to fandom centered on mysteries and theory crafting, that can lead to a lot of different ideas on what the story is. Not always. Sometimes the fandom can reach a general consensus. A good example of that is the Five Nights at Freddy's fandom. Even though the lore and backstory of the games are oblique and hard to find, there's still a generally agreed upon story. Most fans can tell you who Purple Guy is, or who the security guard is in relation to him, or which animatronics house the souls of which children. If that all sounds like gibberish to you, don't worry, it means you're normal. Anyways, the Phantom Manor fandom was absolutely not like that, and lots of people had contradicting views on the Phantom's identities. Many theories were made, and here are just a few of them. According to the backstory, when they started digging for gold in Big Thunder Mountain, the local indigenous people warned them not to do that. The mountain was guarded by a spirit called the Thunderbird, which, by the way, is a real figure in many indigenous American religions, and invading their territory would invoke their wrath. This theory sees that not only did the Thunderbird cause the earthquake, but they also took the form of the Phantom to get back at the Ravenswoods. There are several holes. First of all, if the Phantom was the Thunderbird, you'd think he'd be dressed differently, maybe in some sort of indigenous regalia instead of Victorian garb. Second, going after the manor like this makes no sense. To our knowledge, Melly didn't have much to do with the mining, and the head honcho in charge was already dead. So why would the Thunderbird stick around? Why would they care whether or not she married some guy? There just isn't a lot of evidence there to support it. And then you get into the problematic implications of it. Like I said, the Thunderbird is an actual religious figure in many indigenous American cultures. So making them some kind of grand villain, especially since Frontierland as a whole has so many issues with indigenous representation, just doesn't sit right with me. To my knowledge, this theory didn't have much pull in the fandom, and you can see why. There just isn't a lot of evidence to support it, and it's, to put it mildly, kind of icky. The only reason I'm including it is for a completion stake. Moving on. In order to talk about this, we need to talk about Death of the Maiden. I touched on it in a video last year, but in case you don't know, it's basically a skeleton and a girl together. It has its roots in stories like the myth of Hades and Persephone, but didn't gain prominence until the medieval Europe. What with all the wars and plagues going on. Good thing we don't have that problem nowadays. The generally accepted interpretation of it is that it's a symbol of the balance between life and death. The skeleton is often a Grim Reaper type character, symbolic of death, while the maiden is symbolic of the beauty of life. Franz Schubert's 1817 song of the same name is probably the best known interpretation of the idea. Half of the song is from the point of view of the maiden begging for her life and begging not to die. But then death comes in and responds, telling her it's inevitable. It's nothing personal. Death comes for everyone, whether they want it to or not. So instead of a specific person, the Phantom is death itself. He's here for Melanie's soul, and he's gonna remind us that we won't be too far behind. The parallels between Phantom Manor and the motif are almost too obvious. And in the original version of the ride, we literally saw Melanie age and eventually die. It's not difficult to imagine the Phantom as kind of a Grim Reaper. She evaded him in the earthquake that destroyed Thunder Mesa, and he's gotta finish the job. And he's coming after the guests because they're in the manor at the same time. This does seem to parse. After all, Melanie's fiance has also survived the earthquake, and the Phantom outright killed him. He could be more proactive in the whole reaping thing, taking matters into his own hands when the natural methods don't work. Keep in mind, part of the ride is you falling into a freshly dug grave that he made, into a bunch of catacombs where skeletons come to life. While this didn't end up being the case, it's still a fun way to look at the ride story. You can see all the evidence and parallels and fill in the blanks from there. If years of being in fandom has taught me anything, it's that bucking the canon story is sometimes even more fun than sticking to it. Like any Disney attraction, Phantom Manor was inspired by many different pieces of media, but the most well-known inspiration is Phantom of the Opera. It was the late 80s, early 90s, and Phantom was at the height of its popularity thanks to a hit Broadway musical. Many Imagineers involved recalled seeing the Andrew Lloyd Webber musical and being inspired by it.
An extremely popular Lloyd Webber musical, Phantom of the Opera. I loved it. I still do. And so I borrowed shamelessly. And our character, the Phantom, has a cape. What can I say? Plagiarism is the sincerest form of flattery, or something like that. No, I don't think that's quite how it goes, but nonetheless, yes, we borrowed big time from Phantom of the Opera.
And once you know that, the parallels are all too clear. I talked more in depth about it in my What Inspired Phantom Manor video, so go watch that if you want to hear more. Anyways, the Phantom, Melanie, and the fiance are clearly inspired by Eric, Christine, and Raoul. So naturally, this led many fans to make further connections, mainly making this triad into a love triangle. And if there's one thing I know about a lot of Phantom fans, is that they'll take any excuse to put a Phantom-like character and a Christine-like character together. I'm Team Raoul, and even I'm not immune to it. Not helping this fact is that a lot of the Phantom Melanie content put out there by Disney was kind of shippy. When Disneyland Paris opened, it had a stage show called C'est Magique, which included a Phantom Manor segment featuring Melanie and the Phantom. The way they danced together, how he bridal carried her down the stage, it seemed to only strengthen that theory. Who the Phantom actually is in these circumstances is still up for debate. It could be another suitor, it could be some random Joe in Thunder Mesa, hell, it could even be that Grim Reaper from the last theory. The how and why didn't really matter. The Phantoms had two characters that they could bang together like a couple of action figures and say, "Now kiss!" But that wasn't the only route you could go down if you wanted a romantic Melanie and Phantom. According to the backstory, Melanie's fiancé was either a miner or a train conductor who she fell deeply in love with. He promised to take her away from Thunder Mesa, and when her father was killed in the earthquake, they finally got married. But the night before their wedding, he himself was killed. That is usually the point where his story ends. But in this theory, it's only the beginning. The details are sketchy, but basically, after he died, the fiancé turned into the Phantom. The reason he's going after Melanie is so that they can be finally together forever. However, she might not know that it's him. Or maybe she knows that it's him, but can't commit to following him into the great beyond. Being murdered might have taken a toll on his sanity, so that might be why he's trying to come after us too. Fans who believe this theory had one very important piece of evidence. Tony Baxter, who was the creative head behind Disneyland Paris, has spoken about Phantom Manor several times, and even once gave his own interpretation of the story. I'll let him explain it.
So we see the young, beautiful daughter preparing for her marriage at the start. She's in the hall and all the guests are arriving, and now she's waiting for her Phantom groom. When he finally comes at the end, it's too late, and the only place that the celebration can be is down under.
He made sure to clarify that this wasn't the official story, but the fact that such a high-profile Imagineer believed that the Phantom was the fiancé was proof enough for many people. Sure, there are holes, like who killed him in this scenario? That was clearly the Phantom in the attic, so what sense did that make? Like most of these theories, the people who believed in this tended to just ignore those inconsistencies. And when you factor in the romantic interpretations I talked about in the last theory, it makes everything make more sense. Of course, not everyone agreed it was romantic, which leads us to... As we stated earlier, Melanie's father is Henry Ravenswood. He's the owner of the mines in Big Thunder Mountain, and at least one of the founders of the Big Thunder Mining Company. The stuff with the bullions didn't get brought until years later, and even now that lore isn't very clear, but for our purposes, that's who he is professionally. As a person, Ravenswood was very much, to put it bluntly, a shitbag. He didn't care about the safety of his workers or the town, ordering them to dig deeper even with being warned about the Thunderbird. And he only did so to line his pockets and get more gold. He was a womanizer, sleeping around with lots of women while being married, and at least one of them was one of the house staff. And he forbade his daughter from ever leaving the manor and swore that she wouldn't marry her fiancé under any circumstances. Through unknown circumstances, Ravenswood became the Phantom after his death. He killed the fiance, luring him up to the attic and hanging him. Maybe he expected Melanie to immediately get over it, but when she started waiting for him, he had to kick it up a notch and torment her. While the theory of the Phantom's identity was technically a mystery, this was the most widely accepted story. For many fans, it made the most sense from a story aspect and didn't require pulling shit out of thin air to justify it. Disney never acknowledged Phantom Manor that much, but the couple of times they did, they seemed to lean towards this story. However, you can see that a problem might arise when you have this theory standing in contrast to some of the other theories. The Phantom Manor fandom was never big enough to have ship wars or large-scale dramas, but that didn't mean arguments didn't happen over it. And when both sides really passionately believed in their version of the story, some of those arguments could get kinda ugly. I do think it's important for me to clarify that when I say fandom, I'm talking about a very small subset of it. English-speaking ones, specifically ones from the United States. From what I've gathered through reading and talking to people, most European fans generally accepted that the Phantom is Henry. Not saying that they couldn't have other interpretations of the story. I've seen French sources talk about those as well. But I don't think it ever got quite as intense as the way the American fans did so. The theories persisted for many years until 2018. Phantom Manor closed for a lengthy refurbishment, and it was teased that there was going to be a big story reveal. All of our speculation would come to an end, and we'd finally learn who the Phantom is once and for all. This had a lot of people excited. And while that was going on, there was an interesting development. That same year, Disneyland Paris had a Halloween daytime parade featuring characters of Melanie and the Phantom. And I'll just let the pictures and videos speak for themselves. It doesn't take a hopeless romantic to see the shippiness of it all. This led to a lot of the more romantic members of the Phantom Manor fandom to wonder, what did this mean for the refurb? Were they going down that route? Because it sure seemed like they were. Why else would Disney promote it this way if that wasn't going to be the winning theory? People who hadn't thought about Phantom Manor in years were waiting with bated breath to see what was next. It was an exciting time. Then, on April 12th, 2019, we finally got our answer. Imagineer Tom Fitzgerald was giving a basic rundown of what to expect with the new version of the ride. And during it, he said this.
Ravenswood is the Phantom. He is the father of Melanie.
So the most popular theory prevailed, and the Phantom was indeed Henry Ravenswood. The new story is that, on top of everything else, he thought that no man was good enough for his daughter, and did away with all of her suitors, regardless of how she felt about it. So how was that executed in the finished attraction? They had explicit parallels between Ravenswood and the Phantom. The Changing Portrait Gallery had a new one where he goes from a corruptible mortal state into the Phantom. And they made sure to emphasize his relationship with Melanie. In the foyer, there's a portrait where they go looking happy together, Tim gripping her shoulders possessively. And everywhere in the ride, the Phantom is always hovering over Melanie.
So we used different ways to tell that story, and we did a lot through repeated sightings of the Phantom, so that each time that you saw Melanie, the Phantom was very nearby.
The reaction from fans was mixed. And by fans, I mean the fandom and not just general parkgoers. They seemed to like it fine. I think some of them were expecting something more. All of that build-up and hype, and all they did was just confirm what everyone already knew. They didn't have to go out of their way and subvert expectations, and there's nothing wrong with doing the expected. But I do think some fan reactions surmounted to this.
Was that it? That was it?
As for the nature of his relationship with Melanie, that's a whole nother can of worms. After all that had happened, especially after that daytime parade, fans were hopeful that that was going to be the prevailing theory. And they wouldn't necessarily be wrong. That parade happened months before the ride was set to reopen. and was the only Phantom Manor related content accessible in the park at the time. How are you going to make them all romantic and shippy right before you reveal that they were related the entire time? At least George Lucas had the excuse of not planning ahead. They were in development at the same time. Did no one at the entertainment division think to talk to someone at Imagineering and ask them what was what? Now, I have heard it brought up that this might be cultural differences talking. In Europe, France especially, it's perfectly normal for people who aren't romantically linked to dance like this. Friends, family, all of that. And some of this might just be the actors involved. I don't know how strict Disneyland Paris is about their face characters sticking to the story. So, yeah, that was probably just a fluke. Sorry, shippers. So now that we actually know the mystery behind the Phantom's identity, where did it go from here? How did this part of the Phantom Manor fandom carry on now that one of the biggest pieces of intrigue is essentially worthless? Well, the same way that any fandom carries on. Some people chose to stick with that interpretation and make the most of it, using the basis to further develop the story. Others threw their hands in the air and said fuck it, and kept keeping on with whatever theory they saw fit. There's a common phenomenon in fandoms where the idea behind a piece of media is often more interesting to fans than what's actually in it. People like the idea of a bride in a mysterious fandom being locked in some kind of tumultuous relationship. So, they just take the basis and do whatever the hell they want with it. This is not a unique phenomenon. You can see this in stuff like the Dragon Ball fandom taking Raditz, a character that appears for 3 episodes and is never mentioned again, and creating stories for him that use him to what they believe to be his full potential. This is just another example of it. I'll admit, I kinda did that too. If you follow me on Instagram back in 2019, you might recall me posting a lot of Phantom Manor fan art depicting Melanie with her fiance. I didn't like that he got shafted in the refurb and that Melanie's reason for being in the wedding dress was somehow completely forgotten about. So, I took the idea of him from the attraction and just developed him more. Jake is technically a Disney character, but I changed him enough that I often refer to him as an original character. And we continue to see stuff like this in the fandom. The story is still so intriguing and appealing that you can get into it even if you ignore the current attraction. I even know people that use the basic dynamics and tropes from the attraction to make their own original work and characters. So while Imagineers have tried to put a clear-cut story into Phantom Manor, it hasn't stuck for everyone. Some fans decided they were going to ignore it and continue with their own story. Again, not a unique phenomenon. Sarah Zed made a great video talking about this in relation to the Sherlock fandom that I highly recommend you check out. The fandom has become a fandom in and of itself, and for some, it overshadows the original. Usually when I do these videos, I try to make some greater points about how this relates to Disney history as a whole, but I don't think that applies. Phantom Manor is a great case study as to how fandoms react to mysteries and ambiguity. We can also see how, in real time, people react to those mysteries being revealed, and how it changes how they interact with the work as a whole. It goes to show how transformative the nature of fandom is, and there's a lot of value in that. So to any Phantom Manor fans out there that still feel a little salty that their theories didn't come true, Disney can't take those away from you, and you don't have to let them. So keep on creating and coming up with your own stories. And that concludes the video. Now I'll pass the question off to you. What do you make of this? Were you aware of this segment of the Phantom Manor fandom? What did you think of the reveal, and did it change how you viewed the attraction? What is the most buck-wild theory around the Phantom's identity that you can come up with? Whatever your thoughts, let me know down in the comments. But that's all the time I've got for today. Thank you so much for watching as always, and I will talk to you guys soon. Take care.